So welcome to our panel discussion tonight about the rocky road to climate accountability in British Columbia. I'm Shelley Luce. I'm the campaigns director at Sierra Club BC. And we are talking tonight with three panelists who are deeply, deeply involved in climate issues in British Columbia and across the country. We're speaking with Matt Hulse tonight. He is a staff lawyer at Ecojustice. Also with Kate Kempton, who is an environmental and Indigenous rights lawyer working across Canada. And with Jens Viting, who is the senior forest and climate campaigner at Sierra Club BC. So Sierra Club took the province of British Columbia to court over its climate accountability reporting. And we had a judgment in a couple of months ago on the lawsuit that we brought, and it was kind of a mixed bag for us. And I'm going to actually turn it over to Jens to talk about that, and then we'll get into a discussion among the three of us. But before I do that, I would like to first acknowledge that I am right now on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I would like to encourage others who are joining us online for this webinar to let us know in the chat where you may be calling in from. Thank you very much for doing that. I also want to mention that we are going to have a Q&A for sure, a lively discussion, I'm sure. We'd like to do that after the panelists have had a chance to speak and kind of lay out the lawsuit and the outcomes and where we go from here, and then have a discussion about it. And we'll do that by asking you to put your questions or comments in the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of the Zoom call. And I will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll be able to bring your questions to the panelists when we're ready, when we get to that part of the discussion. Okay, so can we start with Jens?
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. And thanks for the introduction, Shelley. I'm also joining from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in East Vancouver. And before I go into our court case, I want to acknowledge how intertwined colonialism and the climate crisis are, and how we have caused all this disruption as a result of colonialism, and now it's becoming a global crisis, reaching every corner of the planet, including some indigenous nations that managed to escape the worst of colonialism to this date. And it's heartbreaking that we continue to fight this crisis and largely staying in denial about how serious this is. So we hope to take a closer look at this case, why it's important, and really important to acknowledge that not all humans on the planet are equally responsible. In fact, it's the richest nations that are driving this crisis, and we really have a responsibility to lead. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and hope it will look good on your screen too. So in this first part, I will go over some of the key reasons why we decided to take this step, take a look at the legislation we are focusing on, and of course, BC's trends and track records, and a reminder that this policy issue is different from many others. This is a reminder about the key message from the IPCC report in March, how little time we have to bend emissions rapidly, drastically, to have a fighting chance to limit warming to 1.5 or to 2 degrees of warming. But of course, that's a huge difference. We know that we have to aim for 1.5, because 2 degrees of warming will be grave. And we are not close to the trajectory that we need, and we see a lot of denial still, including here in BC, about how quickly we have to address this crisis. And we are taking a closer look at this court case with this background, with this context. Canada is among the top 10 polluters globally, and we are performing poorly compared to other rich nations that are in fact reducing their emissions and are close to meeting targets. Some of them have met targets, like the UK. And the big picture is that BC is performing even worse compared to several provinces. Other provinces are making more progress towards their targets, and not going into the details here, but it's really important as a context piece, because that's one reason why we decided to take the government to court. Now, we are taking a closer look at the targets, our track record, and the targets, and why we see this urgency. So we have in yellow the information about BC's greenhouse gas emissions, at least those that are counted. And we can see that through the 90s and the early 2000s and 2020, we are not seeing significant change. In fact, in the years leading to 2020, emissions went up a little bit, and we have now a little bit of a dip as a result of the pandemic, but we know that's not yet a result of strong climate action. And then we have very concerningly the line in blue. Those are targets that we are not even discussing anymore. When we had a target to have emissions reduced in 2020 by 33%, which would have meant to be at 44 million tons, not at 68 million tons. And now we are looking at a very similar red line, where we are hoping to have a similar result in 2030. And our fear is that with the current climate action package, we might still be in a similar place when that yellow line continues and not being close to our targets. And this time we would pay even more severe price, looking at the already catastrophic climate impacts. And we have more details in our targets from the BC government. We don't have to go into details here, but we have a overall target of 16% reduction by 25, 40% by 2030, 60 by 2040, and so on. And then the corresponding remaining millions of tons on the right side. And we have a baseline here of 2007. And we also have 4 sector targets: oil and gas, industry, transportation, buildings and communities, with corresponding with a range of, so a little bit of a range in terms of percentages reduced. The 2007 millions of tons and the 2020 situation. In some cases, we are in a worse place now, looking at transportation, for example. And in the last column, what we actually need in millions of tons, where we want to head. And the tip of the iceberg in this context, the biggest threat, many threats, but the biggest threat is really new fossil fuel projects. And that's true in the BC context. It's true at the national context, where we also have new oil sands projects and other oil and gas projects. And here in BC, just using LNG Canada as an example, this could quickly become the biggest source of emissions in BC with if both phases of this project go ahead, with at least 10 million tons of emissions here in BC, and then another 68 from burning so much gas in other parts of the world. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but using this early in the presentation because it's really not only a provincial threat to climate targets, it's also a global threat. So one important step in the right direction is BC's 2019 Climate Change Accountability Act, because it does say that we have to report on progress, and it has explicit reference to the 8 targets I mentioned already, the overall targets for 25, 30, 40, and 50. And then those 4 sector targets, which only exist for 2030, that's not insignificant. And the obligation laid out in the law is to have a report that will report on progress towards all of these targets. And we have the 21 and the 22 report, and we'll talk a little bit more about both. Our assessment back in March last year to take the government to court was that we had spent enough time with the BC government, not only Sierra Club BC, Ecojustice, a number of groups, highlighting the concerns, demanding addressing those concerns, the gaps in BC's climate plans, Clean BC and the roadmap to 2030. And we did not see the missing action plans as part of the overall plans. That's why we decided combined urgency and the lack of action that we had to take this step, hoping that BC would ensure that they comply, in fact, with the Accountability Act and report on the missing gaps and come up with the additional actions to address the gaps and give people in BC assurance that we can, in fact, meet our targets, acknowledging that we are in a crisis and there's no room for error. And this is really important because without this, people in BC, NGOs, but everyone else cannot hold the BC government to account. And of course, another important reason is that what's happening in BC is significant for all parts of Canada, but also, I would add, to for other parts of the world. Maybe some of you remember that Premier Horgan talked about how we are only 5 million people in this province and essentially managing expectations. But I would argue that there are few places in the world like BC with 5 million people that have such important decisions to make, with such a significant amount of fossil fuel reserves in the ground, and not mentioning forests. That would be another level of the discussion. But there's a lot we can do in this part of the world, and we must. It's a global obligation. Okay, maybe I pause here. I'm sure I have missed a few things that Matt will add from a legal perspective, and then taking a closer look at the main issues in court.
Thanks for that.
Thank you, Jens. I'm sorry, Matt. I'm going to jump in for a moment. One thing I'd love to request is that we put the presentation on presentation mode, just so it'll be bigger on our screens and we can see it a little better. And also, I would like to, before we move into the next part, just take a moment. That was a lot of information, and we can take a moment to let that sink in and digest a little bit some of those numbers and the importance of a lawsuit in BC, as Jens said, not just to British Columbia, but globally for climate change implications. And I also want to use this moment to say a little bit about, to kind of place Sierra Club and Ecojustice in the context into context here about why we are the ones pursuing this lawsuit right now. I didn't introduce our organizations at the very beginning. So I would like to take a moment to just say that Sierra Club BC is an environmental group that's been around for more than 50 years now. And we started out in a very grassroots manner, and we still do lots of that kind of grassroots work. And we also work at a policy level. And of course, here at the legal level, we don't sue that often, but when there's something where this is the best path to get the results that we are looking for, which is, of course, a healthy, sustainable communities, then we partner with groups like Ecojustice to do just that. So I wanted to mention that. And also I wanted to mention a little bit about Ecojustice. Ecojustice uses the power of the legal system to defend nature, combat climate change, and also fight for a healthy environment. And the kind of public interest lawsuits and advocacy that Ecojustice does are geared toward these kinds of precedent-setting court decisions that help move Canada, and in this case, British Columbia, specifically on our most urgent environmental problems. So I just wanted to give that brief introduction to our organizations and then hand it back over to Matt to continue where Jens left off.
Okay, thanks for that, Shelley. And I'm just going to share my screen. Give me just a moment. And Aurora, can you make me a host so I can
Yes.
share my screen?
Just did that. Sorry, Matt.
Okay, that's okay. Okay, I think you should be able to see a slide now. Is that?
That's perfect.
Yeah, that works. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Hulse. I'm a lawyer at Ecojustice. I'm calling in from the territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, who are today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, what is also known as Victoria. And I'm a staff lawyer at Ecojustice and was one of the lawyers on this file working with Sierra Club. So I'm just going to talk us through the main issues of this case, starting with this slide in front of you, which sets out the key provision, the key line in the legislation that we were focused on. And it says that in the report, which must be released annually, the minister must include the following: plans to continue progress towards achieving the targets referred to in section 2. And those targets are the 4 provincial targets and the 4 sectoral targets. So the case essentially revolves around the interpretation of this one line in the legislation, although it refers to it has to include consideration of the whole piece of legislation and the ultimate purpose of that legislation, what the government was trying to do, what they said they were trying to do when they implemented it a few years ago. So, however, before we get to that question and the actual interpretation, we have to ask, the court has to ask, whether this is a question that it can actually rule on. Because courts don't like to wade into complex areas of policy where the government has a lot of expertise, and climate change and the government's response to climate change is one of those areas. And there's been a few cases in the past in Canada, a few legal cases that have found that plans to address climate change and reporting on complex issues of social policy, such as climate change, are areas where courts don't like to say whether the government has done what they're supposed to do in the legislation. And that's largely comes down to how the legislation is drafted and the fact that the courts like to give the government a lot of deference in how they interpret and apply their own legislation. So in our case, the BC's lawyers argued that the contents of the report, that whether or not the report had complied with legislation, was something for the legislature, the MLAs to weigh in on, not something for the court to weigh in on. However, we argued that interpreting legislation is a very basic role of the courts, and indeed the court could appropriately assess whether or not the minister had met his reporting requirements under section 4.3 of the Act. So fortunately, the court agreed with us, and that we'll mention later why that was that's an important step. So the second issue gets to the meat of the case, which is whether the minister's interpretation of the legislation, and in particular, that particular provision, plans to continue progress towards the targets, was reasonable. And reasonable is doing a lot of work here. It's a key word because the courts don't require governments to undertake the best interpretation of legislation. It doesn't have to be the best possible interpretation. It only has to be one that is reasonable. And when a minister, such as in this case, is interpreting and applying basically his own legislation, so the Minister of Environment applying climate change legislation, the courts give that minister a lot of leeway, a lot of deference as to what a reasonable interpretation could be. So we argued that to properly report on progress towards targets, the report must include an explanation of how far BC's climate plan would get BC to each of the targets that are in the Act, each of the 8 targets. And BC had only actually done this for the 2030 target and omitted to do it for the other 7 targets. So we wanted the report to say for each of the targets that the plan gets BC X% of the way to each of those targets. And we argued that a list of policies that BC was planning to implement to reduce emissions wasn't enough. We needed an explanation of what those policies would actually do in reference to the goal that we've set in the targets. And this would uphold the intended purpose of the Act, which is transparency and public accountability on the government's climate action. So unfortunately, however, the court sided with the BC government and concluded that estimates of greenhouse gas emission reductions and projections of how far the plan would get BC in relation to each of its targets wasn't actually required by the specific words that were in the legislation. So the court had a very narrow view of what was required based on the actual words in the Act. And that reporting on progress towards the 2030 target, which the report did, we didn't argue with that, could also be considered to be reporting to the 2040 and 2050 targets, because those targets build upon the emission reductions that need to take place to achieve 2030 target, because they're sequential in time. We disagree with that, but that's essentially the court's findings. I'll stay here for a minute as I go on to the next stage. So essentially, we have a mixed bag of results. We won on the question of justiciability, but lost on the interpretation of the Act itself. So this is not a complete success by any measure, but it does still help them move the needle forward on climate action for a couple of reasons. So first, a finding of justiciability, i.e. whether a court can weigh in on these types of, can assess these types of pieces of legislation, is important because it sets a precedent for Canada as a whole. It sets a precedent that progress reports on climate action and what are called accountability reports that are drafted by governments as required by legislation can be evaluated in court to see if they comply with the legislation that kind of underpins them. And this is important coming up because the federal government is currently has to draft by the end of this year a progress report on its own emissions reduction plan. So it again, that plan has a set of requirements and the government has to follow those requirements. So this case sets up other organizations to hold governments accountable for their own reporting requirements. And in BC, it sets the precedent that, it sets the stage for the fact that if the language of the Act at hand, the Climate Change Accountability Act, is strengthened to have clear requirements for planning and reporting that are actually robust, then the court could ensure that BC complies with those obligations. So that just says to us, we need to amend the legislation. The second point is that the judge, while he disagreed with us on the central point of the interpretation, he made some really good findings of facts that really help our case moving forward, help our cause moving forward more generally. So first of all, he found that climate change is primarily caused by the production and burning of fossil fuels, which, while that sounds rather basic, is very useful to have in a piece of in case law. And it kind of adds on to a growing trend in litigation across Canada, where courts are agreeing with the basic science of climate change, which is a nice evolution to have, even though we'd argue it's coming a little late. The second piece was that BC has a consistent history of not meeting its targets, and that's BC's gap to its 2025 target was disappointing, because BC isn't anticipated to meet its upcoming 2025 target. Again, very, very basic, these are just facts, but for a judge to repeat that is very useful for us to then take to the BC government and say, this is what the courts are saying about your climate action. The next item is that the court noted that based on currently enacted initiatives, the 2030 targets, like all previously established targets, will probably not be met. Again, nice to hear from a court on this point. And finally, the court, a couple of things. First, the court emphasized that the information sought by Sierra Club, i.e. the emission projections for a certain plan, may actually be useful and may contribute to actually meeting the targets. And that is essentially, that is our whole thesis of our case. This information is important. And for a judge to reiterate that, even while he found the legislation doesn't require that, helps us move forward. And finally, again, this court said that the language demonstrates to us that the reporting requirements in the Act, as currently written, do not do what the Act was intended to do, which is provide transparency and accountability to support the achievement of BC's targets, which, as I mentioned, tells us that this Act needs to be amended to improve our climate reporting and do what BC promised it would do, which was be transparent and accountable. So I'll now invite Kate to offer any thoughts around the case. I appreciate Kate has a very sore voice from doing a lot of good work earlier today on climate and environmental issues. So I'll invite you to speak if you like.
If I can, hang on. Trying to get it very low here. Hopefully it'll get better. I'm not sure this is going to work, but I'll try. This this case is about the Western worldview clashing with a holistic Indigenous worldview, and Canadian law needing to adapt to more of a holistic Indigenous worldview. What Canadian law likes to do is fragment and parcel things off. This case, the assessment of what was reasonable for the judge to find was a very fragmented look at what reasonable is. It looked at it in the context of a vacuum, that what is reasonable in this tiny context of this little box of how to look at language in a statute, with at the same time failing to look at the larger holistic context of what this statute is supposed to address. The fact that we're reaching catastrophic levels for humanity and other species in climate change wasn't lost on the judge, but the dominant worldview is to still put those blinders on and see things in fragments, in little boxes. It provides convenient excuses for being in denial and failing to realize the extent to which we are not interacting responsibly and relationally with each other as human beings and other species of the planet. It's convenient to be in denial when we are a current generation of 500 years of generations that have led to this climate crisis. And so it's a very important case to me in terms of really seeing how far the judges want to go, this and a couple of other cases in Canada recently, on finding the facts necessary to win, finding that this is a crisis, it needs to be addressed. What Sierra Club was asking for here is very important, but still reverting back to the blinders on in the little box, the little fragment of, but I'm still gonna do a really fragmented view of the statute and follow very narrow doctrines of legal analysis without looking at the whole world. My clients, Indigenous peoples across what some call Canada, rail against fragmented worldviews and laws that promulgate fragmented worldviews, because again, it facilitates us from being in denial about the consequences of our actions. It facilitates us being atomistic and individualistic rather than collective and holistic. Collective as part of a larger mass of humanity and a larger organism called Mother Earth. And so we can see the struggle in this decision with the courts, the judges, knowing that we're right and still falling back into that trap of fragmented analysis. Things take time to change. I know we don't have a lot of time, but there will be increasing cases like this, and some judge is just going to go over the edge of the box and say, you know what is really reasonable has to be looked at in more holistic context, the bigger box of the planet, if you will. And we just need to keep pushing in that direction. It's also very important that at the same time we push changes toward responsibility in relationship with the climate and other aspects of the earth, that we ourselves are not fragmented. And that when we bring these cases forward, we also don't make purely doctrinal, narrow, fragmented arguments. And we didn't here. But I know that it's very easy to do when you're practicing Canadian law in Canada, the common law. You know, it's very easy to fall down those very narrow pathways of analysis, but also of seeing the world. And it doesn't help. Canadian law isn't the right law. It's certainly been a contributing factor to perpetuating the status quo, which is a very deeply racist and colonialist country that has facilitated these harms to us all. And you know, some of us are deeply privileged by the advantages we've got from it. But at the end of the day, effectively, we're all going to suffer if we don't fix this. And one of the ways we can fix this is learning from the elders, the nations who've been here forever, that their laws and worldviews need to be respected and transposed into and adapt, change and adapt Canadian law, because Canadian law doesn't have to be British common law. It can learn and adapt to Indigenous law. And I certainly see the signs of the struggle and the desire for judges to get there. They just need to be pushed in further and further cases. Sorry about my voice.
Thank you, Kate. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I want to give Matt and Jens a chance to talk a little bit more as well, and continue with Matt's presentation, and then we'll take those questions from the Q&A box.
Sorry, struggling with mute there. You would have thought after a couple of years of Zoom, I'd figure that out.
All right.
Thank you, Kate, for that, and Shelley. We've got a couple more slides talking about next steps. So ultimately, despite some flaws in the judge's reasoning, we decided not to appeal the decision, and that's for two primary reasons. The first is that courts generally, but also particularly the BC Supreme Court, are conservative beasts. They would most likely grant wide deference to the minister's interpretation of what is reasonable in this instance. And as I said, we don't have to the court isn't looking for the best possible interpretation or the most helpful for the climate. It's looking for a reasonable interpretation in what Kate described as a very narrow view of how to interpret this particular provision. So that's one reason. The second reason is that the judge's findings, which I outlined before, that support the fact that climate change is a problem, the fact that this information that BC hasn't missed its targets is likely to miss its future targets, and the fact that the information that Sierra Club was asking for would be helpful to provide transparency and accountability, set us up nicely for a push to amend the law and to go to BC, the BC government, and say, hey, listen, this act isn't doing the job you wanted it to do. Let's make some changes. So that's what we'll discuss next. So as I mentioned, law reform. How do we actually amend the Climate Change Accountability Act? And there's one opportunity presenting itself in the next few months, in that BC has committed to introducing a new target for the year 2050. And that target is achieving net zero emissions by that date. So our job for this particular target is to ensure that it focuses on emission reductions and not rely on carbon offsets, because net zero emissions can be accomplished by theoretically planting a lot of trees, except that carbon offsets are very unreliable at reducing emissions and have a number of other broad social and environmental issues. So we need to ensure that this target is written in a way that ensures that it, at a minimum, progresses to that target by reducing BC's emissions at least 80%, and then maybe, if necessary, allowing the last 20% to be addressed by carbon offsets. So we need to focus on prioritizing emission reductions. So the fact that BC is inserting this target in the next few months, hopefully by the end of the year, gives us an opportunity to say, hey, listen, while you're at it, let's open up the rest of the act for consideration and improve the planning and reporting requirements in the legislation. So when this act was introduced, it was the most progressive and may have even been the first piece of climate change legislation in Canada. And now, however, or since then, the federal government has introduced climate change accountability legislation, which is much more robust, is much more detailed, and sets a new standard for this type of legislation in Canada. So our argument is that, hey, while you're introducing this new target for 2050, let's also match the federal legislation and boost the planning and reporting requirements in your own legislation. So we would like clear requirements for plans, clear requirements for reporting, to ensure that the BC government is required to, in the type of detail that we were asked for in our case, to report on the gaps to their targets, the effectiveness of their plans, and how they will address any gaps and deficiencies in their plans moving forward. So basically, addressing the things that the judge said were problems with the legislation, but being very explicit so that they can't wiggle out of it with these unreasonable interpretations of what the legislation says. So Jens, would you like to go chat about the Climate Solutions Council?
Yes, Thanks, Matt. And we can use your screen for the next slide and take a look at the latest report from BC's Climate Solutions Council. So this is the cover on the left, and we have had a Climate Solutions Council for a number of years, and the latest version of this council going back to 2017 with some changes when the BC NDP won the election. And I believe this latest one, which at some point showed up on the BC government website in February, is the strongest one. And it's really a stark contrast in terms of honesty, looking at gaps, looking at risks and challenges that are largely omitted in BC's own climate accountability reports. So they have a strong introduction looking at the latest science, IPCC reports, acknowledging, among other things, that that existing fossil fuel infrastructure is incompatible with climate targets. So there's some level of detail that is systematically avoided in BC climate accountability reports because it's not compatible with some of the development happening in BC. And this list of pitfalls in climate policy implementation is similarly explicit. We're not going to look at all of them, but insufficient implementation of compulsory policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, lack of independent assessment of policy impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. There's some strong language, and then in the later part, they're looking at 8 opportunities that are mostly overlapping with these pitfalls to address these challenges. And of course, we have to look at number 12 in this list, approval of new high-emission industrial projects. And in other parts of this report, there's a lot more detail on LNG and methane from fracking. The level of detail, again, that we are missing in the climate accountability reports, and really modeling what we need to address this crisis. And I really want to acknowledge that there are good steps in Clean BC and in the roadmap to 2030. And one of the reasons why we are so concerned about new projects is that they would undermine, they would essentially neutralize the potentially positive results of some of the good steps in Clean BC. And Matt, can you go to the next slide? This is just one map showing all the LNG projects on the books, LNG Canada and several others, adding up to around 50 millions of tons of annual production if they would all go ahead. And that's a global threat. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking at emissions that would not only undermine provincial targets, once including the additional emissions from burning so much gas in other countries. We are looking at more than doubling the current emissions of British Columbia. And we can fool ourselves, but we cannot fool the atmosphere. We have to keep fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And just using this as one example, there's a lot more information about this global threat, why we need the strong policy now. The BC government announced a new energy framework in March, but it's still a plan to make a plan. We are now hopeful that there will be a cap on emissions this year, but it's still short on details at this point. So we are approving new projects, but we still don't have the details on how this is even possible to build new projects and reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector by at least 1/3 in 2030, knowing that several of these projects might go ahead in the meantime. I think is there one more? Okay, then I thought that we have one last slide from the latest climate accountability report.
Oh, there it is.
Exactly. So I included this as my last one to acknowledge one step in the right direction. So this is very concerning information, but it's good that it's included in the last climate accountability report. So we have not seen the change that we want, but we have seen some limited change, some evolution between the 2021 report and the 2022 report. And that's it's a little hidden in the report and not something that the BC government wanted to talk about in their media release, but we are currently not on track to meet the 2025 and the 2030 targets. And this is a huge challenge. This is seriously concerning information, but it's important to include it. So our hope is that we will see more honesty and more information addressing gaps in climate action in the future reports. So this is one example that everyone can look at. So simply searching online for the Climate Solutions Council report and looking at the pitfalls and opportunities. That's something that every MLA, every minister, every MLA in BC should be aware of, and demand that we have similar honesty and action on the recommendations in the coming climate action plans. That's absolutely crucial. Maybe I will pause here and allow some discussion and questions.
Great, thank you, Jens. Thank you, Matt and Kate. Yeah, we have a few questions in the Q&A. I have a question, kind of a clarification maybe from Matt. I would love to hear about the new 2050 net zero target. And I think you said that this, one of our next steps is to push the BC government to make their next plan at least as detailed and transparent as the federal.
So there were two pieces there. So one is the net zero target, which BC government has committed to introducing into the Climate Change Accountability Act. So we need to make sure that target is robust, it is reliant primarily on emission reductions, and is not dependent on carbon offsets to achieve that target. So while they do that, that is our opportunity, that is our window to introduce a broader amendments that would improve the planning and reporting requirements in the legislation to match the federal legislation, which applies to the federal government's emissions plan. So it's not saying that they'll just accept our recommendations, but that is the time when they're doing one piece of amending one part of the legislation to introduce other ideas. And I think there is a strong case that we should have a consistent standard of climate accountability across the country, and that BC should step up to match the federal standard.
Mm-hmm. And how does the outcome of this lawsuit help us in ensuring that the new plan focuses more on emission reductions and less on offsets or other key requirements that we want to see in that plan?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily helps us in particular on the net zero target. I think we have to make other arguments there, and we certainly can. There's plenty of evidence around the deficiencies in carbon offsetting. And there are examples in other jurisdictions around the world, like Sweden, for example, that has committed to go net zero by I think quite early, almost 2040 or even 2035. But but prioritized emission reductions in getting there, so they weren't dependent on offsets. So there's examples that exist that we can point to, but the case in particular helps us strengthen the reporting requirements in the legislation, because the court has said that BC's missed its previous targets, it's likely to miss its future targets, and the information that Sierra Club asked for in the case, detailed estimates of how the plan is expected to perform in relation to the upcoming targets, that type of information will help hold BC accountable and will help us get to our future targets. So we'll simply say, a court has agreed with us that the act is not written adequately enough to do the job that you intended it to do. So your intentions are good. Let's just draft the act to deliver on those.
Mhm. Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just to emphasize that the short-term targets, 25, 30, but also 2040 targets are all clearly not associated to any offset path. So we have to meet those -16, -40, -60 even without offsets, and that will not change. So the net zero language is at play for 2050, but the reality is that unless we make progress now in 25, 30, 40, it's not easy to tell whether we will still have functional governments in 2050. We really have to make progress now, otherwise we would end up at levels of warming that are incompatible with functioning policy.
Dyer. There's a question here about reasonable, and our audience member has asked, why isn't reasonable defined as something that makes sense to a reasonably informed member of the public? And Kate touched on this. Kate, I'm wondering if you can respond to that question, which was asked before you spoke. But really, you just you started to describe how a fragmented or reductionist worldview results in a definition of reasonable that doesn't seem reasonable to those of us listening today, looking in at this case. And then you also talked about Canadian law needing to adapt to a more holistic worldview. I'm not a lawyer. I don't really know how law adapts. Can you talk a little bit about that, especially in the context of this lawsuit or climate lawsuits?
Oh, well, I'll try. Common law is judge-made law. Common law is just the accumulation of decisions from court cases. Statute law are all the statutes and regulations on the book. They all adapt. They all, you have a new government in place that can pass a new statute, a new regulation. Judges build on former case decisions, precedent shifts and changes. We're not the same country we were 100 years ago. 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. 60 years ago, there was the white paper that government policy suggested that there were no Indians left, or shouldn't be, that there should be, everybody should be of the same culture. There's things shift, they adapt. It's never really clear whether, it's a combination of both. Law, changes in law can cause changes in culture. Changes in culture and principled behaviors can cause changes in law. In many regards in Canada, it was law that shifted gay rights, for instance. In Toronto, I happen to be sitting in Toronto right now. when I first moved to Toronto 30 years ago, the gay village is very different than it is today. And one of the primary motivators of gay rights in Canada was the change in the law. In that case, some of the courts were more progressive than the public at large, I think. So law always adapts, and therefore I'm hopeful that judges who are human beings, who brought up in a certain dynamic and worldview, like the Western worldview predominantly in Canada at any rate, will adapt and change somewhat. And because I think human beings do have a great capacity for survival. We also have a great stupidity in not being able to make the changes to survive until we're standing at the precipice. But, I'm one of these people that suggests, as do many elders who have their stories about the shifting winds in the future, and Anishinaabe and other stories, other prophecies. I'm not commenting on whether they're going to be right or wrong, but long told stories about the humanity coming to the edge of the precipice. And frankly, many elders and myself hope that we push ourselves there faster, because that means that we'll just get to a solution faster. It's the slow, agonizing nature of watching us all kill ourselves that is so harmful, I think, so painful. But on the other hand, law needs some time to adapt usually. So Canadian law is built on a principle called incrementalism. It's not supposed to shift too much per case, because then it creates unpredictability, so the theory goes, and social instability if the changes are too big and too radical. But they will have to be bigger and more radical in the world we're facing. And I think that they will be as we push closer to that precipice. We're human beings, judges are human beings, and I think they're going to have to see the writing on the wall and realize that the way that the reasonable person would see reasonable in reality, that it's not just interpreting the exact language of paragraphs in a statute and how the words fit together in one phrase with another phrase. That's how they look at reasonable. It's a very navel-gazing view of how to read the language in a statute, and not looking at what that statute's greater relationship is with the rest of the world. That's how they do it now, but I do believe they'll change.
Well, you said a lot there, and one thing that I get from that is that lawsuits like this are really important for pushing that adaptation of the law. That's part of incrementalism, and hopefully will push some big steps instead of tiny steps.
Yeah, the more we keep pushing, the better in my field of Indigenous rights predominantly. I expect to lose a bunch of times, and I'm not doing my job if I don't lose, because I'm trying to get the law to adapt and change. You have to accept a number of losses before the shifts in culture and the shifts in the winds, the anxiety that rises in the media. All these things affect culture, and culture affects law, and vice versa. So, it's a reflection and a reflector of culture. And so the more we bring, the faster the change is likely to occur. Accepting a loss in this scenario, if we didn't have one, frankly, I'd say you weren't doing your job. But then the next case and the next one, there'll be more of a win. So you have to do these. It takes a lot of courage to lose, but you have to do it.
There's a lot there. I wonder, Matt, if you want to respond. You're also fighting these legal battles and have had wins and probably some losses as well.
I think Kate captured it very well there. I think it is challenging sometimes to understand why reasonable is not as straightforward as one would think and does not capture the big picture. For example, in our case, we spent a lot of time discussing the purpose and intention of the legislation, which doesn't even go as far as Kate is suggesting in thinking about the big picture, but it talks about the big picture of the act, and it was what was discussed in the legislature when the act was brought into force about, you know, responding to the issue of climate change and recognizing that the government had missed previous targets and noting that they needed to be held accountable. The public demanded they be held accountable, and this is all great language, and we drew on that in making our arguments about how this particular line, this particular provision in the legislation should be interpreted. But the judge, well, it wasn't reflected as in the case decision as we would have liked. And indeed, the judge focused on the fact that the particular line in the act that we were arguing about didn't include words like GHG emission estimates, which were found in other parts of the legislation. So thereby saying that if the legislature hadn't included it in this part of the legislation, but they clearly thought about it in other parts, then there was clearly a reason they did that. And one of them was that they didn't require that type of detailed information that we were asking for. So I think, as Kate said, that's a very narrow view of the purpose of this legislation and the role that it can play in helping get us to our targets, which is the ultimate objective of the legislation. So I do hope that our thinking evolves, and we are seeing positive signs, but not as quick as we would like.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from the audience wondering if we have any major concerns with the current federal reporting requirements. So we've talked a lot about the BC reporting requirements and the lack of accountability despite the Climate Accountability Act. How do you all feel about the federal reporting requirements? Jens.
Yeah, I would use this opportunity to highlight that both the federal and the provincial reporting are very problematic in that they, in different ways, they are hiding the information about logging forests, and that's a huge concern. So the emissions associated with logging are very significant, and so a reminder that we see the officially counted emissions are often around 60 million tons. Then we often have another 40 million tons associated to logging, and then on top of that we also have climate impacts, emissions from wildfires and so on. But that's a huge concern, and it's happening both at the federal level and at the provincial level. And we do have to, it's complicated, we have to acknowledge that, but we do need more prominent and transparent reporting on all emissions, whether from burning fossil fuels or from clear-cutting old-growth forests, and then we need climate action addressing all these emissions, and the emissions. So earlier the topic of offsets came up, and it's really important that we understand that we have to reduce emissions in every sector and not choosing one instead of another. It's simply too big, the problem. So that's something that governments have to get creative about and find solutions that are meaningful to inform policy.
And maybe I'll jump in there as well. I mean, one example of problems with the emission reporting that we've just came across the news today, this past week, was the oil sands maybe under-reporting or under-measuring their emissions by about 31 million tons, which is, I think, something in the realm of 40% of their current their current emissions. So how we measure emissions, not just report them, is also part of the problem. With respect to the federal requirements in the legislation, we haven't yet seen the federal government use them. So this will be the first time they do so in this upcoming progress report, which is due at the end of 2023. So we're not working with Sierra Club BC on this, but Ecojustice is kind of looking at these requirements, and will be making recommendations about how they should be interpreted by the federal government to ensure that they do provide the type of granularity and detail that we need to really understand how the federal emission reduction plan is being implemented, and whether the regulations and measures are actually effective and doing what they're supposed to do. There was a report out this week by the Canadian the Commissioner for Environmental and Sustainable Development, which is a kind of an auditor, a watchdog within the federal government, within the Attorney General's office, I believe, of the federal government. And basically, one of the reports that they produced said that a sample of 5 emission reduction regulations that the federal government is using did not demonstrate how they were connected and supporting, how they were contributing to achieving the 2030 target, the 2030 federal target, i.e. they also weren't, they have a policy, but they're not saying whether or not it's doing what it needs to do. So there's no real way to assess whether this policy needs to be tweaked and adjusted to ensure that it helps us get to where we want to go. So that's coming from a federal auditor, and looking forward at this next progress report, we need to ensure that the federal government patches up those holes and tells us exactly what the emission reduction plan is doing and whether it will get us to where we need to go. And if not, what will they do to ensure that we do reach our targets?
So the federal government's own auditor is coming to similar conclusions about the federal government reporting.
Yeah, similar conclusions in how they're discussing their policies. They haven't, like I said, the federal government hasn't yet applied their own reporting requirements from their legislation. So we haven't seen exactly what they'll do. They could do a good job, but what we want to do is to get ahead of that and start to socialize the idea with them that they need to be quite comprehensive and robust in that reporting. Mm-hmm. To avoid the type of narrow interpretation that Kate is warned us about.
Okay, thank you. Another question from one of our listeners. They point out that often in Canada, the economy takes precedence, presumably in the discussions, and we do have this decades-old argument of a dichotomy between the economy and the environment, or jobs and the environment. However, they point out that we saw with the COVID crisis that when lives are threatened, the government can change gear and do it quickly. So the question is the Canadian law, as Kate discussed it, on the side of economy? Does it somehow weigh jobs and the economy differently than it would the shift in culture and people themselves demanding a change? Is there any reason that the law is going to give deference, let's say, to one of those over the other? That's for any of you to weigh in on.
I'll let Kate talk. Yeah.
I'm always afraid to talk because I think I'm bursting people's eardrums here, but I think that's again, law is a reflection of society to some extent. It moves it and is moved by it. I think that's a question about the Western society. You know, we have midbrain instincts for security and survival, and lots of texts on psychiatry and sociology suggest that as we've moved away from the caves and the soil and the farms, we don't know what to do with these midbrain instincts, and we don't manage them, and we don't apply critical analytical thinking to them, and basically that becomes fear that turns into greed. And so we're all thinking we're squirrels storing away as many nuts as we can for the winter by getting more money through jobs and contracts and businesses and fraud or whatever it is we're into. You know, and that's the society we live in. And, you know, law certainly does reflect that. But I mean, I have, for honor, for respectable Canadian judges, some of them aren't, you know, it's more about the analytical reasoning that they apply when judging something like a statute is a bit of a puzzle to them. It's a very narrow intellectual engagement rather than a holistic engagement, as I said. And you know, we need to pull the judges out of having their heads stuck up, you know what, and looking at reality more, and that keep expanding economies in a world that is contracting doesn't work. But judges will also award significant precedent-setting injunctions to protect First Nations lands and things like that. So they're not all about favoring the economy over interests. interests. It's just that they do so now if you can prove your point within a very doctrinal framework of critical analysis under the law, rather than looking at the law fitting into a larger society.
Great, thank you, Kate. We have a question about fossil fuel projects. The question is talking about stopping new fossil fuel developments, but is it not true that existing projects already condemn us to increased emissions? And I know we can answer that question, and I would add to that kind of a question about, you know, we heard about new LNG facilities being announced at the same time, a cap on emissions from new facilities. It can be a little confusing to pull those apart and understand what that actually means for emissions, either in BC or globally, and also how that possibly could fit into real climate accountability planning and reporting for BC. So I wonder if Jens or anyone can answer some or all of that two-part question.
Yeah, I can try. And first of all, yes, it's we are clearly already in very uncharted, dangerous territory with the existing infrastructure, and the new projects, new LNG terminals come with permits for 40 years, and it's clearly incompatible with the needed reduction path. So what this means is that we are making the problem bigger. We are making the risks bigger, including for communities. We know that if some of these projects go ahead, and even the existing projects could become stranded assets if our governments decide to act more decisively in the very near future, in just a few years. If we have more severe climate impacts and see a large last-ditch attempt to reduce emissions faster, we could see even more stranded assets. And it's highly irresponsible because the solutions exist. We know that renewable energy is moving even faster now. The one response after the war started in the Ukraine is that several countries in Europe took additional action to move even faster with heat pumps and many other steps to get off fossil fuels, and we're now expecting that that will be reflected in global trends. So there's absolutely no reason at this point to continue on this path, and we have a lot of work to do to prepare communities for the climate impacts that are already at play, to be better prepared to save lives, to safeguard houses, homes, and infrastructure. There is no lack of jobs, and in fact we will need a lot more, and we need every single dollar to support these solutions, from renewable energy to adaptation. And that's why we have to take the full range of possible actions, including court cases, to get the change that we need.
Maybe I'll just add to that by saying, and I think Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, recently said that we need to do everything, everywhere, all at once to address climate change. And he was quoting the name of a recent Oscar-winning movie, but it's very true. So we need to both stop new fossil fuel projects, as well as figure out how to wind down existing projects. And this leads us into the discussion of what is a just transition away from those existing projects, and how do we support the workers and communities who currently depend on those jobs and that income in their local economies. How do we support them to greener, more sustainable jobs that have paid decent wages and can provide for a good standard of living in those communities? Unfortunately, our governments don't want to accept the fact, certainly not in the public, that we need to wind down. We'll have to pick a date at some point to phase out fossil fuels. Germany has decided to do so with coal by 2038. Countries already, Denmark is phasing out its oil production. We have to be realistic about the fact that this industry is A, killing the planet, and B, is going to go through a very volatile period given the decline in demand for fossil fuels, and the fact that the fossil fuels we produce in Canada are both some of the most carbon intensive and the most expensive to produce, so that our oil will suffer as the market declines, more so than oil produced out of, say, the Middle East. So, you know, the federal government is currently drafting legislation about the just transition, but unfortunately, uproar from Alberta's premier forced them to change the name of it to sustainable jobs legislation. So if we can't even say the words of what we're trying to accomplish here, a transition away from fossil fuels, then it leaves me little hope the legislation and plans will actually do the job either. But that's the fight that's in front of us, and I think that legislation will be tabled in maybe a month's time at the federal level. So I think we need to figure out how to respond to that and get our MLAs, our MPPs, our MPs to figure out that the population, the public, wants a managed, proactive, thoughtful, inclusive transition away from fossil fuels. Which, circling back to the comments about economy versus the environment, I think, you know, building the green economy creates a lot of economic opportunities all across Canada. We just need to recognize that vision and then go ahead and start building. So plenty of jobs if we have the vision to do so.
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite sad that there are groups, people, industries that don't want to use the words just transition. And it's also interesting you mentioned that coming from Alberta. I believe Alberta has a very fast growing renewable energy sector as well. So in some ways, it's just about the choice of where you put your investments.
It's one of Alberta's best kept secrets.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone. We're getting close to the end of our discussion here. And I would like to take a minute to mention a couple of ways that people can get involved through Sierra Club's work. And I'd love to give Matt a chance to talk about same with Ecojustice. I just want to welcome our folks on the call to join Sierra Club in this work. There are many ways you can do so. Of course, you can support us with a donation or become a monthly donor and help us to bring lawsuits like this in partnership with Ecojustice and push that transformation of the law that Kate talked about. We want that to happen faster than the incrementalism that you described. And we also have some really wonderful ways to get involved that we believe then that we can see are contributing to a paradigm shifts, that we don't have to talk about jobs or the economy versus environment anymore. So please check out our website. It's called invitetoaction.ca. And it is an invitation for people who want to take action, who want to do something tangible, to join us in a whole variety of ways, including letter writing campaigns, learning how to move the dial at your own city council or other local government where you may see a need for different bylaws that can help limit greenhouse gas emissions or protect biodiversity. These are all kind of driven by all of you, the folks who want to see change, and then mentored by people at Sierra Club and our many partners who can help take the energy that so many in the public feel and help convert that and really move the dial in so many different ways. So those are a couple things I want to mention. Of course, joining us here and asking us questions and helping to expand our discussion of all these things is extremely helpful as well. So thank you so much all for participating. And Matt, if there's anything you'd like to add there, please do.
Yeah, thank you. Ecojustice is a not-for-profit. We're a charity, so we're able to do the work we do supporting organizations like Sierra Club BC through the generosity of donors across Canada and likely around the world. So, you know, I always invite you can become a donor to Ecojustice and help us use the power of law to challenge take on these issues and tackle these environmental challenges in Canada. You can also become an Ecojustice supporter by subscribing to our newsletter, which is at our website. That will provide updates on some of the most pressing environmental issues that we're working on. You can also take action on some of our letter writing campaigns to decision makers, and that's a good way to make your voice heard as well. So I'll pop our link in the chat there, ecojustice.ca. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you, everyone. Ecojustice.ca, sierraclub.bc.ca for much, much more information on these issues and other links in the chat now as well. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Kate and Jens and Matt. It was extremely informative. Lots of comments in the chat, including one that says, knowledge is power. And I agree. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today.